Putin is running out of soldiers, and his new bet could be his most fatal mistake. In August of 2024, Russia began importing troops from North Korea, a country whose military training literally consists of digging trenches and marching through mud. But what the Kremlin did not expect was that these men, before firing a shot, would begin defecting to the enemy. As Moscow tries to hide the desertions, North Korea pretends nothing happened, and China watches in silence. Today, you will see how this unlikely alliance could accelerate the collapse of the Russian army and redefine the balance of power in Asia. To understand how this disaster began, we need to look at the most unlikely and desperate alliance Moscow has ever made. By 2024, Russia no longer had experienced soldiers to send. After 2 years of war, the losses had reached nearly 500,000 dead and wounded. The elite units had been reduced to a fraction of what they once were. The Kremlin began recruiting anyone it could find: prisoners, poorly trained volunteers, and now, foreigners. With Russian ranks running thin, the military command decided to bet on an unlikely reinforcement: troops from North Korea, a massive army, but one frozen in time. The deal between Moscow and Pyongyang was born in secrecy. The idea was simple and shameful. North Koreans would be dressed in Russian uniforms, given fake names, and integrated into mixed battalions. Officially, no one would know that Kim Jong-un's soldiers were fighting in Ukraine, but the plan fell apart before the first battle even began. According to Ukrainian intelligence reports, dozens of North Koreans began deserting shortly after crossing the border, many voluntarily surrendering to Ukrainian forces. Some even brought their AK-74 rifles as proof of surrender, saying they had been sent by force. Russian radio intercepts reveal panic in the communications, officers scrambling to hide the real number of casualties and desertions, while the Kremlin ordered total silence on the matter. The truth is, these soldiers were never ready for modern warfare. In North Korea, military training still means digging trenches, marching through mud, and reciting ideological speeches. Most of these men had never faced a real enemy, let alone an army trained with NATO doctrine and equipment. They were thrown into a battlefield where drones, precision artillery, and electronic warfare decide who lives or dies in seconds. And when they realized that, many understood that their only chance to survive was to run. While the Russian army was sinking deeper into improvisation, Ukraine was doing the exact opposite, transforming itself into one of the best trained and most well-equipped forces in Europe. According to the Kiel Institute, NATO countries have already provided nearly $240 billion in military, financial, and humanitarian support to Ukraine since the start of the invasion. To put that in perspective, that amount is almost double Russia's entire annual defense budget, which is around $120 billion. This colossal difference in resources completely changed the balance on the battlefield. While Moscow struggles to replace ammunition and armored vehicles, Kiev receives Leopard 2 tanks, Patriot systems, HIMARS, F-16s, and even real-time intelligence from Western satellites. Every dollar invested translates into precision, and every weapon sent represents a potential defeat for the Russian army. Even with numerical superiority, Russian command failures have multiplied. The offensive against Kharkiv in 2023 was the biggest disaster since the beginning of the war. More than 70,000 soldiers lost between dead and wounded, dozens of tanks abandoned, and a chaotic retreat broadcast live by Ukrainian drones. And when the Kremlin tried to change the narrative with its so-called national pride, the T-14 Armata, the result was even worse. Of the few models sent to the front, most broke down before firing a single shot. The tank that was supposed to symbolize modernity became a synonym for logistical failure. Too expensive, too heavy, and completely useless against Western missiles like the Javelin and the NLOW. Each failure reinforced what analysts already knew. Russia no longer has a modern army. It has a museum on wheels. Meanwhile, Ukraine has learned to wage war in the 21st century. FPV drones have turned ordinary soldiers into precision shooters. Reconnaissance systems powered by Starlink, artificial intelligence, and coordinated strikes with long-range Storm Shadow missiles have redefined the battlefield. War, once decided by tanks and infantry, is now fought through data, sensors, and response time. And in this arena, Russia is always a few seconds and a few decades behind. On one side, an army reinvented by NATO. On the other, a force still trying to win with Cold War tactics. But nothing exposed Russia's collapse more clearly than what happened on August 6, 2024, the day the war crossed the border. In the early hours of that morning, a Ukrainian force made up of mechanized units, FPV drones, and sabotage teams crossed the border and entered Kursk, inside Russian territory. It was a lightning operation, planned with surgical precision. The attacks began at 3:40 a.m., striking ammunition depots, radar sites, and communication centers. Russian intelligence simply never saw the offensive coming. The first Ukrainian armored vehicles advanced 30 kilometers without resistance, while drones destroyed Russian columns still on the move. In less than 6 hours, entire villages in western Kursk were under Ukrainian control, something that had seemed unthinkable until then. What was supposed to be a defensive line turned into an open corridor, and the message was clear. Russia can't even protect its own territory. Russia's weakness became even more obvious because of one of its own laws. Since the beginning of the invasion, the Kremlin had forbidden the deployment of conscripts, mandatory soldiers, to fight outside Russian territory. When Ukraine attacked Kursk, that created a paradox. The army couldn't mobilize its best troops because they were tied down on other fronts. The result was disastrous. The defense of the region fell to inexperienced recruits, reservists, and even administrative units. In interviews given after their capture, Russian prisoners admitted they had received only 2 weeks of training and didn't know how to properly operate combat vehicles. Some didn't even have maps of the area where they were fighting. While officers tried to reorganize their lines, Ukrainian forces advanced in a coordinated fashion, destroying logistical positions and cutting off communications. The Battle of Kursk became a brutal portrait of unpreparedness and of the arrogance Moscow tried to hide. Faced with the collapse, Putin reacted as he always does, with threats. He ordered strategic exercises with tactical nuclear missiles in a desperate attempt to remind the world he still had power. But in practice, nothing changed. The military response in Kursk was slow, confused, and poorly coordinated. While propagandists spoke of a tactical regrouping, Ukrainian drones kept destroying entire convoys. The Russian counteroffensive didn't actually begin until 3 days later, enough time for Kiev to capture dozens of armored vehicles and hundreds of tons of ammunition. Putin's nuclear bluff convinced no one, not abroad and not inside Russia. And it was right after that humiliation that the Kremlin realized it needed something, or someone. That was the moment when the idea of importing soldiers from North Korea stopped being a rumor and became a survival plan. When Putin asked Kim Jong-un for help, the world saw it as an agreement between dictators. But for Pyongyang, this wasn't charity, it was an opportunity. North Korea is facing one of the worst economic crises in its recent history. With closed borders and international sanctions choking the regime, the country is suffering from severe shortages of food, fuel, and foreign currency. By aligning with Russia, Kim Jong-un found a way to buy political time and ensure economic survival. In exchange for soldiers and ammunition, Moscow promised shipments of grain, fertilizers, oil, and even military technology, including missile and satellite components that North Korea could never legally obtain. But this deal is not just transactional, it's symbolic. Russia and North Korea signed a mutual defense pact back in 1961, and reviving that relationship is a way to challenge the West and prove that an axis of resistance still exists. For Kim, sending troops to Ukraine is also a show of power, a way to demonstrate to both his people and his enemies that the country is not isolated, and that the People's Army still has a purpose beyond military parades in Pyongyang. But the cost of that gamble began to show quickly. The soldiers sent to Ukraine live under unimaginable conditions, long shifts, poor nutrition, and constant surveillance. Most of them earn less than $1 a day and were raised under decades of indoctrination. When they come into contact with Ukrainian propaganda showing free cities, people with internet access, and promises of asylum, the psychological impact is devastating. Reports of desertions have multiplied. Some soldiers abandoned their posts, carrying their own rifles, and surrendered to the Ukrainian army. Others simply fled into forested areas and disappeared. For Kim Jong-un, this scenario is a direct threat. Each desertion is a stain on the image of absolute control the regime tries to project to the world. And the longer the war drags on, the harder it becomes to maintain the loyalty of men who are discovering, for the first time, that another kind of life is possible. But the impact of this alliance goes far beyond the battlefield. China, the main economic partner of both nations, watches in silence and with growing discomfort. Beijing fears that North Korea's direct military involvement could destabilize the region and give the United States a reason to further strengthen its presence in the Pacific. And the risk goes even further. If North Korea continues sending troops and weapons, South Korea could interpret it as a direct threat, reigniting tensions on the peninsula. One miscalculation, one misread provocation, and what began as an alliance of convenience could spiral into a new international crisis. In the end, Kim Jong-un may find himself fighting two wars at once, one in Ukraine and another, far more dangerous, in his own backyard. In the end, what began as a marriage of convenience between two isolated regimes may turn into the exact opposite of what Putin expected. The Kremlin's attempt to reinforce the Russian army with foreign troops exposed a brutal paradox. The more Putin tries to show strength, the more he reveals weakness. The North Korean soldiers, unprepared and afraid, didn't bring combat power. They brought instability. The desertions weakened morale, allies began to question the legitimacy of the war, and the world saw an army that no longer trusts even its own men. Instead of regaining control, Putin created a political, logistical, and diplomatic mess all at once. The alliance that was supposed to strengthen Russia might end up accelerating the very thing the Kremlin fears most: the collapse of its own war effort. North Korea's involvement changes the game forever. If this strategy fails, and all signs show that it already is, Kim Jong-un could find himself isolated even by Beijing, which avoids being associated with internationally condemned operations. Russia, in turn, would lose one of its last partners still willing to provide any kind of support. Ukraine, meanwhile, emerges from this episode politically stronger and with an increasingly modern arsenal, while Moscow loses credibility even within the very axis it tried to build. In the end, the Russia-North Korea alliance may go down in history not as a show of strength, but as a symbol of desperation. And now the question remains: do you think Putin's gamble with North Korea can really change the course of the war? Or will it be the final nail in the coffin of his military campaign? Share your opinion in the comments. Now, while Putin struggles to find soldiers, another, and even bigger, problem is beginning to emerge, this time made of steel and rust. Russia is dragging tanks out of the shadows that should be sitting in museums, trying to turn scrap metal into firepower. But what the Ukrainian army discovered when these zombie tanks returned to the battlefield surprised even Western analysts. Click now on the video appearing on your screen and find out what happened when Russia decided to resurrect its forgotten tanks. And don't forget to subscribe to The Military Ground. See you there.